An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence, like the sentence, I am running. See, here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now, sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now, a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So a noun clause can begin with WH question words, like what, which, when, where, who, or whom, and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally, we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses.
Commas have many different functions, but their three primary functions are to separate clauses, join independent clauses, and they're used to avoid confusion. So since we talked about separating and joining clauses, let's first talk about what a clause is. A clause is a piece of a sentence. If you have a dependent clause, it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It would be a fragment. If you have an independent clause, it would be able to stand alone as a sentence. It would be independently a sentence on its own. So dependent clause can't be a sentence by itself, depends on the rest of the sentence. Independent clause stands alone, can be a sentence all by itself. So let's look at how we can separate clauses with commas. You will use a comma to separate a dependent introductory clause from an independent clause. So one way that dependent clauses are used is as an introduction to a sentence. For instance, before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. We use this comma to separate the dependent clause. So before the game is dependent. You cannot say before the game all by itself and have it be a complete sentence. It's only a prepositional phrase. So it is a dependent clause. But then you have Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. This would be independent. It could stand all by itself. So we are separating the dependent introductory clause from the independent clause. Before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. And you notice how you pause where that comma is. And a lot of times, that's why a comma is there, to get you to pause so that your sentence makes sense as you're reading it, either to yourself in a book or aloud to someone else. So, dependent clause as an introduction needs a comma. Now, let's look at if we kind of switch the order of the sentence up. Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. When we put before the game at the end of the sentence, we don't need to have that comma anymore. We only needed the comma whenever we wanted to pause to let people know that before the game was separate and to realize the action was happening after that. So Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. Here, we didn't actually have to put a comma because the independent clause came first. So we had our dependent clause at the end, no comma needed. Now this is in this situation. That doesn't mean there will never be a situation where you will have a dependent clause at the end that needs a comma. If you have several items in a series, you may still need a comma toward the end of the sentence. But if you're using an introductory phrase, if it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you need the comma. If it comes at the end of a sentence, generally you won't. Let's look at another way that we use commas to separate clauses. You will use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following conjunctions. And a conjunction is basically a connector word. And, but, or, for, nor, so, and yet are common conjunctions. If you have two independent clauses, that means two phrases in a sentence that could stand as a sentence on their own, and they're connected by one of these conjunctions, then you will need a comma to separate those two. We are going to the movies, or we are going to a nice restaurant. So here's our conjunction, or. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. We are going to a nice restaurant is an independent clause. So the comma is needed to separate two independent clauses. Now, let's look at if we combine this sentence a different way. We are going to the movies or to a nice restaurant. Here, we have that or, which would be a conjunction, but let's look. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. To a nice restaurant is dependent. To a nice restaurant cannot stand by itself. We don't have a subject in that clause. In this version of the sentence, we had we are going still included. So we still had a subject and a verb, so this was a complete thought all by itself. So it was an independent clause. It could stand as a sentence. To a nice restaurant is missing that. It's missing both your subject and your verb. It's not been made a complete sentence, so it's dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So in this instance, we did not have two independent clauses. So no comma was needed. Okay, now let's look at the second primary function of a comma. to join independent clauses, to avoid short, choppy sentences. So generally, whenever we are going to join independent clauses, we're doing it so that we don't have a series of short, choppy sentences. Now you're going to see that this might look a little similar to where we separated independent clauses. Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. Okay, and this one we had an independent clause, or a conjunction, and an independent clause. Let's look at the next version of this set of clauses. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. So Sarah plays softball. This is independent. Runs track is dependent. We have our conjunction, and enjoys swimming is dependent. Yet we still had those commas. And then let's look at the last version. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. So all three of these are going to be independent clauses because they are complete sentences. But they're short, choppy sentences. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. We keep hearing Sarah over and over, and these sentences are short. We can combine them to make it a smoother flowing sentence. So you could have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction like we did up here, and then you would use that comma to separate them. But you are still joining multiple sentences when you do that. So you're using those commas to separate the clauses, but you are using them to also join two sentences into one. So Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. So here we used our comma to join these two independent thoughts. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. Well, we had dependent clauses here, but we still had a conjunction. The reason we're going to put commas here is because you've got three or more items in a series. If you list three or more items or clauses, activities in a series, you're going to separate them with commas. So the reason we're using it here is to separate three or more items in a series. Here we were using it to separate two independent clauses. And then at the end we had no commas. We just had three complete sentences, which basically equaled three independent clauses. So we had to find ways to combine them. So we could combine all three into one sentence, and we could use our rule of using three or more commas in a series to join these different independent clauses, or we could use our rule of separating two independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction and keep two independent clauses instead of separating it up and making it dependent clauses but three different activities in a series. We could say Sarah collects bananas, apples, and tomatoes. We would have to put commas in that series too. Sarah collects bananas, comma, tomatoes, comma, and apples. So when you have three or more items in a series, you have to put your commas to separate them. This is going to be helpful when you're combining different ideas to be able to join independent clauses and in other instances. If you have just two sentences that you would like to combine, you can do so using a conjunction and a comma. As long as it's still an independent clause on each side, you will need that comma. Let's look at the third primary function of a comma. They are used to avoid confusion. I want to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn for dinner. Without a comma in this sentence, it sounds like you're saying you want to eat chicken broccoli. Well, you probably don't know what chicken broccoli is, and that's because it's not a real food. What would make more sense is if we said I want to eat chicken, comma, broccoli, comma, and corn for dinner. Then you would be telling someone you would like to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn. 3 items, not chicken broccoli, which makes chicken look like an adjective to broccoli. Now, this comma here in a series, if you have 3 or more items, the comma immediately before and is optional. Some people like the way it looks, some don't. I like the way the comma looks. It helps me feel more organized when I'm writing, so I always put it in. But you definitely need this comma because otherwise the meaning of your sentence is unclear and you would not be avoiding that confusion that commas are supposed to help you avoid. Let's look at the next example. Before we eat, our dog has to eat. This doesn't make sense. Before we eat our dog, you're not going to eat your dog. But if you're reading this sentence quickly, without a comma there to slow you down and make you pause, you don't read it correctly. You would have to read it a second or third time to get what the author's meaning actually was. So you would say, before we eat, our dog has to eat. And maybe this is so that your dog isn't going to bother you while you eat. If your dog's already eaten, then you can eat happily. So before we eat, our dog has to eat. And this is one of those dependent introductory clauses like we talked about up here. We use a comma to separate clauses, and that can also avoid confusion. So you see how some of these rules tie in together. Commas in a series, commas in a series. Introductory clause being separated from the independent clause that is the rest of the sentence. Dependent clause separated from independent clause. So a lot of the rules of commas may overlap a little bit, but these are 3 of the primary functions you're going to see commas used for. That doesn't mean you won't see them used any other way. They're also used geographically if you're talking about a city inside of a country or inside of a state. If you're talking about dates or times, then you may also use commas. Commas are used in people's names sometimes if you're putting a junior or a senior. So these aren't the only times you're going to see commas, but in writing, these are the primary functions in which you are going to see commas used.
It is important to capitalize certain words according to grammar rules. Because when you don't follow grammar rules and you capitalize a word you shouldn't, or you don't capitalize a word that you should, it becomes distracting to the reader because they may know that specific grammar rule. And capitalizing certain words helps the reader follow along with your train of thought because it may help them realize when a sentence is beginning or when you're talking about a person's name. So we're going to look at this passage and identify the capitalization errors. So starting out, we're looking good. Then we go to the word January, and we see the J right there. The J is small, and it should be big. So that's one thing we should capitalize, months. Then we continue on to which was a Friday, and we find that the F isn't capitalized. So I'm going to write days. So you don't capitalize the word days, and you don't capitalize the word months, but you do capitalize months of the year, like January, February, December. You capitalize days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then it says we went to the Museum of Science on a class trip. So museum and science both need to be capitalized because this is a specific place. You don't capitalize of because it's not an important word. So you need to capitalize museum and science. And then notice right here, class does not need to be capitalized because there's no reason why it needs to be capitalized. Now we go to this sentence, and the is not capitalized, even though it's the first letter of the first word of a sentence. So we need to capitalize the first word of a sentence. The class took a bus to the museum. Now you may be thinking that museum needs to be capitalized here as well because we capitalized it over here. But here we're talking about the Museum of Science. It's a specific museum. Here we're just talking about a museum in general, so it's not capitalized. It was a lot of fun. That sentence looks good. My teacher, Mrs. Jones, and some parents came with us. Now the first word of the sentence is capitalized, which is good. Jones is capitalized, which is the last name. We always capitalize last names. But then Mrs. isn't capitalized. And so you need to capitalize abbreviations before names. Abbreviations before names. And so those can be things like Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs. All those abbreviations need to be capitalized. And so those are some examples of words that do need to be capitalized, but there are many other grammar rules out there, but those are some common words that are accidentally capitalized or accidentally not capitalized.
Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water, those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples, and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So, knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor, but because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying, because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed. Or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence.
An introduction is a vital part of a paper because it sets the tone for the rest of the paper, and oftentimes a reader will decide to read past the introduction only if the introduction is well written. So it's very important that you put some thought and effort into the introduction. So there's two things an introduction needs to include, and there's many things an introduction should not include. So first, the things an introduction should include. 1, a thesis statement. And 2, an attention getter. So a thesis statement briefly tells what the paper is going to be about. Now you're not going to structure your thesis statement by saying, I'm going to tell you about, or my paper will explain this. It's more of a general concept or a general argument that the entire paper is going to refer back to. So every concept and idea in the paper is going to fall under the umbrella of the thesis statement and relate back to it. The thesis statement generally comes at the end of the introductory paragraph. It'll be a sentence or two, but it needs to come at the end of the paragraph. Don't start at the beginning of the paragraph because the beginning of the paragraph needs to have the attention getter. And the thesis statement is an the attention getter. The attention getter, like it sounds, gets the reader's attention and then leads up to the thesis statement, which tells what the paper is going to be about, or the general concept the paper will be talking about. So what makes a good attention getter? Many times this can be a surprising fact, something that will surprise the reader, making them want to read more. Sometimes telling an interesting fact about some well-known person, or telling a quick story. It may be a personal story, or maybe a personal story about someone famous. All those are good ways to start off a paper. Sometimes giving a little bit of background information, but don't make this like a textbook. Make it really interesting and come alive for the reader. So that keeps the reader reading, and that leads up to the thesis statement, which is to come. So that's the main two things that need to be in the introduction. Watch out for anything else that would get in the way of having an attention getter and a thesis statement, because that's all you really need in the first paragraph. Anything else will get in the way and slow down the action.
Parallelism. Parallelism means writing with a parallel structure. That means all nouns, verbs, and phrases should have the same structure. Let's look at some examples to see what that means. In example 1, John runs fast and plays hard. There we have multiple verbs, runs and plays. So they should be parallel. They should have the same structure. And both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they are simple verbs. They don't have any suffixes. They're third person. We're talking about John. You're not saying I did this. You're saying John did this, talking about someone else. And it's present tense. He's running and playing right now. He runs and plays in the present. So they agree. Both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they have parallel structure. So this one is good. Let's look at example 2. My hobbies are playing the piano, running marathons, and reading books. So we have 3 phrases there, but they all start with verbs. So let's look at those. Playing the piano, running marathons, reading books. This sentence also has correct verb structure. Playing, running, and reading are all present tense, and they all have ing as a suffix for them. If this sentence didn't have parallel verb structure, it would seem awkward and disjointed. Think about it. If it said, my hobbies are playing the piano, run marathons, and read books, it wouldn't make sense because you've got one with ing, one that's present tense, and one that's past tense. They all have to agree. They all have to have the same structure. They need to be the same tense. They need to be the same, have the same suffix, or all not have a suffix. And all these things are important whenever you're writing a sentence that is more complex than just something with one subject or one noun and one verb. If you have multiple nouns, verbs, or phrases, you need to make sure they have parallel structure. So again, this one was good, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't sound very good. It would sound awkward and disjointed. Let's look at example 3. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks on the beach. This one was another one with 3 verb phrases. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks along the beach. Swimming and building are both present tense with ing endings, but took is past tense. It does not have the ing, and it makes our sentence sound disjointed. So this one needs to be revised. So let's talk about some ways we can do that. We already have swimming and building, so we could make that last phrase agree with the first one. If we do that, we could say, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and taking walks along the beach. And that is one correct way to fix this. Now, that isn't the only way. Let's look at another way, because whenever you're trying to find parallel structure, you don't necessarily have to make it all match the first verb that you come to or the first noun that you come to. You just have to make them all have the same structure. So if we took them all out and we came up with a different way, we could say, when we went to the beach, we're going to take out even more of it to make this one make sense. When we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So in this one, instead of leaving the first two in the present tense with ing suffix, we changed them all to match that last verb, which was past tense. But we took out having we here because we already had we at the beginning. We didn't need to keep repeating we. We could just make the phrases go after it and have parallel structure so that they made sense. So another way to fix a sentence was to say, when we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So we changed them all to past tense, and now they match and have parallel structure. So now we've revised it, and it's good. So whenever you're writing, make sure that your writing has parallelism. You want to make sure that all the nouns, verbs, or phrases have the same structure so that your writing makes sense and doesn't sound awkward or disjointed. Persuasive essays. When writing a persuasive essay, the writer will try to convince the reader to adopt the opinion of the writer on a particular issue. They do this in many different ways, but they should demonstrate a keen understanding of their audience. You need to know who you're writing to, who you're trying to convince of this opinion. Consider the interests, prior knowledge, and learning styles of the audience. So think about who you're writing to. Are they going to be interested in this topic to start with, or are you going to have to get them interested? Are they going to have any prior knowledge about this, or is this the first time they're going to be reading about it? How do they learn? What's the best way that you could support your thesis so that they would eventually adopt your opinion? These are all things to think about when you're writing. At the beginning of every essay, you're going to want to develop your thesis. Now, the thesis is going to be in the introduction of your persuasive essay, but it's going to be at the end, not at the beginning. So in most papers, your thesis will be at the beginning of that introductory paragraph, but not in a persuasive essay, because in a persuasive essay, you want to establish credibility first. You want to win the trust of the audience, or at least their interest, before you tell them what you're trying to convince them of. And one way to do this is to use an anecdote or story. If you start off your paper with a short anecdote or story, it kind of warms the audience to you. You may give them a little bit more information that lets them know you are a credible source to be talking about this topic, and then introduce your thesis. Then introduce what it is you're going to be trying to convince them of in this persuasive essay. Now, once you've established your thesis, there are several ways that you can develop it, but we're going to discuss 3 different persuasive essay techniques today. One is making claims. You're going to give lots of supporting ideas to your main argument, so you should have small claims along the way that support the central argument. You make one big claim at the beginning when you tell people what it is you're writing about, what it is you're trying to convince them of, but you're going to make several small claims along the way that support that central argument. Claims should be rooted in fact and observation. These claims cannot be something that is just your opinion. It can't be something you made up. You can't say, I think chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. You could say, I think a an ice cream parlor should serve more varieties of chocolate ice cream. And you could back that up by going and doing some research, looking to see what kind of money the store might make if they had different ice cream flavors. And you could back it up. There's facts, there's observations, there's statistics you could look at. But if you just say, chocolate's the best, there should be more chocolate, that's just your opinion. It's not a small claim that would be confirmable. And that leads us to this part. Must be confirmed. Any facts that you include, any observations must be confirmable. You must be able to go back and show where you found them, show that it's a true statement. So, with any persuasive essay, include references when possible. Show where you got this information. Don't make the reader go find it. Present it to them to show that you are being upfront about this. What you're saying is true. What you're saying is the right thing, and they should believe you. It further establishes trust with them. Another way that you can develop your thesis is with examples and expert opinions. Examples are most effective when they complement facts. So you've laid out some facts and observations. Now give some examples that support those, because examples are a good way to make dry facts more interesting or understandable. Sometimes a writer will present a fact and you'll say, I don't really know what they mean by that. But if they give you an example to back it up, then you say, oh, that's what they meant. So using an example can make your audience understand what you're trying to tell them better and make it more interesting, because sometimes facts are dry and hearing a lot of facts in a row may just be boring and may not actually pull your reader's interest toward that opinion you're trying to convince them of. If you use an expert opinion, your expert should have a title or credential of some sort that clearly indicates the expert's knowledge and experience in the topic. So if you're saying someone is an expert on, let's say, a certain drug, then you may want the doctor to be there to say, oh, well, amoxicillin really does have all these health benefits, and here are all the things that I can tell you about that. You want a doctor. You want him to be able to show he's got a degree in medicine. You don't want it to be just someone that comes on and says, oh yeah, I've given my kid Amoxil several times and my kid always gets better after a cold. That's not what you want. You want someone who's got verifiable credentials to be an expert. Now, we've looked at making claims using facts to support your thesis and using examples and expert opinions to back those up, but you can also look at emotional appeals. Opinions are formed by emotion as well as reason. So these are going to play more on reason, more on logic, where emotional appeals are going to pull on a reader's emotions. These should be used in a proper and ethical manner. And that's important to remember. If you're going to appeal to a reader's emotions, you need to be responsible about it and make sure you're doing it the right way. And let me show you some examples to expand on that. Think about drunk driving ads. Sometimes you may see some really sad and graphic things in those ads, but what's being shown is shown to you to let you know that this is a serious issue, that people should not drive after drinking because there can be terrible consequences. Anyone using that information should be using it to support not drinking and driving. And so even though it's pulling on your emotions, it's doing it for a good reason. But then let's look at politics. A lot of times, one candidate will put out an ad saying how patriotic they are, showing how they've served their country and all the ways they're patriotic. And that's really nice, but often it's going to also imply that the other candidate competing against the first one is not very patriotic, and that's usually far from the truth. Meanwhile, that first candidate's patriotism is going to link them to voters. Voters are going to say, oh, I really care about the country too, so I need to go with this guy because he's patriotic and the other one isn't, even though that's not true. So you don't want to mislead your audience with emotional appeals. And one other way that can be done is with loaded language. If someone is extremely religious and they're called a fanatic, The word fanatic has a certain connotation to it that is negative. The same way if someone was environmentally conscious and someone called him a tree hugger, that has a negative connotation. So using loaded language words like that can give negative connotations and pull on a reader's emotions that way. And that's not what you want to do. You want to use it to support your argument, but not put down other things. So whenever you're writing a persuasive essay, make sure you're keeping in mind who your audience is, what their interests are, how much they may already know about the topic, and what's going to help them the most. And then you can decide if you want to use small claims along the way, expert opinions and examples, or emotional appeals to back up your thesis. But the most important thing you're going to need to do is to win your audience's trust. You want to establish that you're credible so that you can convince them that your opinion is the correct one. Point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told, and the narrator is the person who tells the story. So when we're looking for point of view, we're looking to see if we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator that's telling us the story. In first person, your narrator is going to be your main character, and they're going to be saying I, me, we. These are the pronouns you're going to see associated with the first-person narrator. If it's the main character, you're only going to get to know what the main character knows. You're only going to get to read about what that main character does or what he does with someone else. But you won't know about anything that doesn't happen involving the main character because this is written from a first-person point of view and you're only going to hear from this viewpoint. Third person is the most common point of view. And you're going to see pronouns like he, she, and they. The narrator is going to talk about other characters, but the narrator is not one of the characters. And third person omniscient is very common as well. Omniscient means all-knowing. So a third person omniscient narrator is going to be one who describes all other characters. So at once. So this narrator is going to be able to tell you what every other character in the story is thinking, what every other character in the story is doing. Now they may not actually do it all in the same passage. Sometimes they split it into chapters. So one chapter is written to where the author is telling you everything that Johnny does. One chapter is split to tell you everything that Susie does. So you find out everyone's point of view, but possibly at different times. But the author is able to do all that without actually being a part of the story. So whenever you're looking for who your narrator is, the pronouns are the important thing to look at. Let's look at this passage. John walked to school every day. He and his friends were often cold and tired by the time they arrived. They were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. In this passage, let's look at the pronouns to help determine the point of view. And your pronouns are going to be words that take the place of nouns, such as I, me, we, he, she, they, it, you. But these are going to be the ones that are really going to set you off as markers to let you know if it's a first person or third person narrator that you're listening to. So looking through this, we have he and his friends. By the time they arrived, they were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. And it started with John. So the narrator is using he and they and someone's name. Now, first person could use someone's name, and that's why it's important to look at the pronouns. But the narrator starts talking about John, and then he uses all of these third person pronouns. The narrator is a third person narrator here. Oh, let's write it out. Third person. And you know this because you're looking at the pronouns. And the pronouns are all telling you that the narrator is telling you what's happening, but the narrator is not a part of the action. So the point of view is a third person point of view. So whenever you're going to find point of view, you want to know this because the perspective of the story, who it's coming from, is important. If it's coming from a certain character, or if it's coming from a first person or a third person point of view, then you're going to have a different plot or have information, more intimate information in first person and a greater variety of information with third person. So it's always important to determine your point of view whenever you are reading a story. So just keep in mind that the best way to find that is by looking at the pronouns, I, me, and we, he, she, and they. Purpose. An author writes with one of four purposes in mind: to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. Once we figure out which one of these four purposes the author is writing with, we will be able to better understand his or her motivations for writing. If the author is writing to inform, it will probably be nonfiction. And some examples you might see are research papers or recipes. You are getting information. The author is informing you of something. They're informing you how to do something. It's nonfiction. Their purpose is simply to inform you. If the author's purpose is to describe, it will probably be fiction. And it's going to have lots of details. A descriptive story or paper is going to elaborate on details. It's going to give you as much description as possible, and a lot of times that's going to be something that's a work of fiction. While you will have details in an informational paper or writing of some sort, it's not going to be the same kind of details you'd get in a descriptive fictional narrative. If the author's purpose is to entertain, then it will also probably be fiction. And you will have humorous and or dramatic elements. Now, something that's funny or humorous is going to be entertaining, but something dramatic can be just as entertaining as something funny. And some of the best stories are going to have humorous and dramatic elements in them. So something written to entertain is usually fiction, and it will sometimes have both of these elements, or sometimes just one or the other. But it's written to entertain you, to make you feel entertained, like you are reading a story that you are enjoying. If the author is writing to persuade you of something, you are probably going to see an editorial or an advertisement. All those ads you see on TV are meant to persuade you to buy something, persuade you that one product is better than another. So that is where advertisements are going to be one of the primary places that you see persuasion writing. An editorial in a newspaper may lean toward or against a certain topic or candidate in a political campaign, and so those are also written to persuade you one way or the other. But most people are going to see ads on almost a daily basis, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on the TV, whether it's on a billboard driving down the highway. So this is something you'll see every day, whether you're trying to or not. So the four main purposes an author will write with are to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. And once you determine what the author's purpose in writing is, you will better be able to determine the author's motivation for crafting his work.
A subject, along with a verb, completes a sentence. Every sentence must have a subject and a verb. So always be looking for the subject in a sentence because it has to be there somewhere. Look at this first example. Running is good for you. The verb right here is is. So then what is the subject of this sentence? Well, the way you can find the subject is it's the person or thing that's doing the action in the sentence. So what is in this sentence? Running is. So running would be the subject. Okay, so think of another example, like he rode his bike. Okay, rode is the verb here. So again, you can just ask the question, who is riding here? Who is the person or the thing doing the action here? Well, the action is riding, so then who is riding? He is riding, so he would be the subject. Over here, she is cheerful. Okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful, so she would be the subject. Now this is going to get a little bit more complicated now. She is cheerful, but her friend looks sad. So right here you see a verb, and then, okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful. She is the one doing the action in the sentence, and that's being cheerful. So she is the subject. Now you look down here and you see another verb, looks. So what's the subject over here? Can there be two subjects in a sentence? There can. Because notice right here, but. But is what we call a conjunction because it joins two clauses together. So we have a sentence here and a sentence here, and but is joining them together to make them one. But if we have a sentence here and a sentence here being joined together by but, that means we must have two subjects and two verbs. So we found one subject and one verb, and then we found the other verb, so we're still looking for a subject. So what could the subject be? Could it be her looks sad? That wouldn't make sense, because remember, the subject is who or what is doing the action. So someone is looking sad in this sentence. Who is looking sad? The friend is looking sad, so friend is the subject over here. All right, like I said, every sentence has a subject and a verb, but you may come across some sentences like this. This sentence says, go to your room. So the verb here is go. So where is the subject in this sentence? Well, the subject is what we call an understood you. So we're going to put you in parentheses right there. So I say it's an understood you. Basically, it's understood that you is the subject of this sentence, so it doesn't even need to be included. So we could actually read this sentence as, you go to your room. But we don't always speak like that. Sometimes we leave the you out of the sentence, so we just have a verb. But nevertheless, there still is a subject. It's just not included in the sentence. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as is the subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said, since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense. A suffix is a part of a word that is added onto the end of a root word and cannot stand alone. So many times in a word, you have a prefix, a root, and a suffix. And so the prefix, the root word, and the suffix all combine to make one word. Now sometimes you only have a root word, sometimes you just have a prefix and a root word, and sometimes you just have a root word and a suffix, and sometimes you really just have a prefix and a suffix. But you're never just going to find a prefix, and you're never just going to find a suffix. It has to be paired with something else. Now a suffix has a meaning of its own, and so it changes or enhances the meaning of the root word that is added to it, and so it forms a new word with a little bit of a different meaning. So we have the word happy. Now we also have a suffix, which is NESS. Now this line right here means that it's a suffix. If the line was after the word, it would mean that it's a prefix. But right here, this means it's a suffix, meaning the root word comes before it. So now if we combine happy and ness, we get the word happiness. And so we know what the root word means. We know what it means to be happy or joyful. But ness right here means the state of. So the suffix right here changes the meaning of happy to mean the state of being happy. So you can say that person is experiencing happiness. You wouldn't say they're experiencing happy, but you would say they're experiencing happiness. Now, think about the word geometric. You may not even be familiar with this word, but you're probably familiar with some of the parts of it. So we have geo, which is the prefix right here, and so that means earth. So I'm just going to write that right here. Geo means earth. And then we have this right here, METRI, which means the measure of. It's kind of similar to the word meter. And then we have the suffix IC, which means having to do with. So we can come up with a definition here that means having to do with measuring the earth, because we have these definitions of the parts of the word, so we combine it into one approximate definition. Now, if you were to look up this word in the dictionary, you would find that the dictionary definition is of or relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles. So by using the definitions of each section of the word, we weren't necessarily able to define exactly the definition of this, but we were able to get a general idea. Now, think about the word ophthalmology. So with this word right here, we have this first part of it, which comes from the word ophthalmos, which means eye. And then we have the suffix right here, which is ology, which you've probably heard of a lot. Zoology, ecology, geology. And ology means the study of. So again, we can come up with an approximate definition. So this must mean the study of the eye. And so an ophthalmologist is someone who studies the eye. And so it's a doctor who deals with eye problems and does eye surgeries. So if you just looked at ophthalmology and thought that's the study of the eye, you're not getting an exact definition what ophthalmology is, but you're getting an idea that it's the study of the eye and the problems with it. And so there's definitely going to be a more specific definition of it, but you're able to get a general idea of what it's talking about. Now, a couple of the suffixes we looked at here were ness, ick, and ology. And there are many more suffixes. And so if you're able to learn the meaning of some of the suffixes, then you can oftentimes just look at a word and figure out what it means. Another thing you can do, say, for example, like I said earlier, say you saw the word zoology. And so you don't necessarily know what this means. Say you don't know that ology means the study of. But you have heard of the word geology, and you know that means the study of the earth or of rocks. And so you can look at this right here and think, okay, ology must mean the study of, and I've heard of the word zoo, that's a place with a lot of animals, so zoology must mean the study of animals. So think about words that are like this word, think about words that have the same suffix, and think about the definitions of that word, and then that way you can figure out the definition of the word in question. So again, a suffix is a part of a word that is added onto the end of a root word and cannot stand alone.
Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man's struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me? Transitional words and phrases. Transitional words and phrases are used to guide the reader through the text. You've probably seen a lot of these common transitional words and phrases before, but you may not have thought about what their operation is, what their purpose is in the paper. So let's look at the different ways transitions can be used. You can have transitions that show time information. For instance, after, before, during, in the middle of. These all tell you when in time something is happening. You can also have transitions that indicate an example is about to be given. For example, in fact, for instance, if you say something, if you state your main idea and then you want to give a supporting example, you can say, in fact, let me tell you this thing. For example, dogs make good pets because they are very loyal. These phrases let you know that an example is coming. Transitions can be used for comparing. Also, likewise, you're saying how two things are alike. This is also like this. Likewise, we can look at how dogs are good companions. You can also use them for contrasting, saying how two things are different. However, but, yet, you would like a dog for a pet because they are so companionable, but a cat is not going to be as affectionate. They won't make as good of a companion as a dog. So you can contrast two things using however, but, yet. Transitions can be used to suggest addition, to let you know that more is coming. And also, furthermore. These all let you know more is coming. More examples are coming, more information is coming, more details of the same sort. You can have transitions that reflect logical relationships. If, then, therefore, as a result, since. If I go to bed late, I might be tired in the morning. I went to bed late, therefore, I was tired in the morning. So these transitions reflect logical relationships. And our last example for transitional words and phrases are steps in a process. And these words show that exactly. They're showing steps in a process. First, you'll gather up all your ingredients. Second, you'll mix the dry ingredients in a bowl. Last, you'll take the cake out of the oven. So these steps are telling you exactly what's happening first, second, third. They may throw in next after that. They may not want to just put numbered all the time. Like last isn't telling you the 10th step, it just uses the transitional word last, but it still is giving you an idea of what step that is in a process. So make sure you use your transitional words and phrases where they will orient your reader and illuminate the structure of your composition. You want to let your readers know where they are in your paper. If you're saying first, this happens, next, this happens, or if it's steps in a process, first you do this, second you do this. Or if you're comparing and contrasting things, you would say, well, here's this, likewise, there's this. However, there's this if you're contrasting. And you want to illuminate the structure of your composition. If you're writing a compare and contrast essay, these compare and contrast transitional words are going to help highlight that that's what type of essay you're writing. If you're writing a persuasive essay, you might see a lot of examples. If you're writing an instructional essay, you'll see a lot of steps in a process. If you're writing an informational essay, you may have some logical relationships. So using these transitional words and phrases can help let your reader know what the purpose of your writing was. So please always include transitional words and phrases in your writing because you want to guide your reader through the text and let them know what your purpose is.
Linking verbs do not express action. Instead, linking verbs express a state of being. So you have action verbs and linking verbs. And so linking verbs are reserved for expressing a state of being. So an example is, John was a doctor. Was here is a linking verb, and it's expressing a state of being, John being a doctor. And then the grapefruit here is too sour. The grapefruit is too sour. So is the linking verb here, and again it's expressing a state of being because it's describing grapefruit. So in addition to was and is, some other linking verbs are am, are, were, be, being, and been. Now, a noun or an adjective is going to follow a linking verb. So when an adjective follows a linking verb, it describes the subject. So an example is, this fruit is mushy. So we already know that is a linking verb. And so we look at the word following the linking verb, and we know it has to be a noun or an adjective. And we know that mushy is an adjective, and so it must be describing the subject. And sure enough, mushy is describing the subject, which is fruit. Now, when a noun follows a linking verb, it renames the subject. So here we have he is a doctor. Again, the linking verb is, and so the word following it is doctor. And so we know that doctor is a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. And sure enough, it is, because doctor and he are interchangeable here because they're referring to the same person. Now, some sense-related verbs can also act as linking verbs, such as feel, look, smell, sound, and taste. And then there's some other verbs in general that can sometimes act as linking verbs, like appear, become, grow, and seem. And so we have some verbs that can be either an action verb or a linking verb, depending on their meaning in a sentence. Some examples are appear, become, feel, grow, look, smell, sound, and taste. So right here we're using the verb grew. So here is an example of it as a linking verb. Mary grew ill. And so a linking verb is going to have a noun or an adjective following it. So here we have ill, which is an adjective. And so since it's an adjective, it must be describing the subject. And sure enough it is. It's describing Mary. It's saying that Mary is ill. Now here we have an action verb. We grew tomatoes. It's the same word, but this time it's acting as an action verb. Now pretend for a second that it is a linking verb. We look at the word tomatoes and we see that it's a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. Well, we and tomatoes aren't interchangeable because we and tomatoes are not the same thing. So we know that grew here must be an action verb. So you just have to base it off the context of a sentence when you're trying to decide whether a verb is acting as a linking verb or an action verb. But when you come up to these words up here, these verbs are always going to be linking verbs. But when you come to sense-related verbs as well as some other verbs, they can act as a linking or action verb. An alliteration is a stylistic or literary technique. It's basically when successive words begin with the same sound or the same letter. So consider this sentence. She walked through the thick, thorny grass. Notice that through, the, thick, and thorny all start with TH. And so remember, the definition of an alliteration are words that begin with the same sound or the same letter. In this case, they begin with the same letter and they start off with the same sound. So that's why this sentence is an example of an alliteration. Now, I said this was a literary technique, and literary techniques generally are there for a reason. In this case, it's to show the difficultness of getting through the grass, because saying 4 words that start with a TH in a row is somewhat difficult. It's kind of a tongue twister. Through the thick, thorny grass, through the thick, thorny grass. I couldn't say that 10 times fast because it's difficult. And that's the point of the author here. They're trying to help the reader understand the difficulty of walking through this grass by making it difficult to say. And so this technique is used in the opposite way around in poetry. Many times letters or sounds that sound good 3 or 4 times in a row are used to give the poetry a musical sound so that it sounds very pleasant to the ear. Take a look at another example. Right here it says glassy globes of glitter. Here the author is trying to describe someone's beautiful eyes. So they use the phrase glassy globes of glitter. So this is an alliteration because these 3 words all start with GL. Now, of course, you may be thinking, okay, it says successive words, and right here, of is in between those. Well, it's okay for one word in there not to start with the same sound. That's all right. But glassy globes of glitter are the words we're focusing on here. Now, the 2 letters it starts out with are GL, and GL is difficult to say in a row. It's kind of like the effect up here. But in this case, we're not talking about something that's difficult. We're talking about something that's beautiful, some pretty eyes. And so the author shouldn't have used these words because it makes it sound like the eyes aren't very pretty. Because up here, the purpose was to make it hard for the reader to say because they were talking about how terrible the grass is. But if you're talking about how beautiful something is, then the words describing it should also sound beautiful. So the writer could still use an alliteration, but they should pick letters or sounds that sound better when they are repeated. Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into 2 main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable. They're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story. Many times, the definition of a word can be determined by looking at it in context. Now, generally, this can be a pretty easy task by just looking at words around that word to figure out the context meaning. Now, sometimes words are much harder to determine the meaning of. So I want to go over a couple of those cases. Take this sentence, for example. Frank's admonition rang in her ears as she climbed the mountain. Now, say you have no idea what admonition means. The best thing to do is substitution. Take other words that you think would fit in this sentence and see if they make sense. So the words vow, promise, advice, complaint, or compliment all make sense in this sentence. Like you could substitute advice for admonition. Frank's advice rang in her ears, or Frank's compliment rang in her ears. So although these words all fit in this sentence, they all have somewhat similar but really different meanings. But the main thing you need to realize here is that admonition must mean message, because these are all types of messages or something he spoke to her. So the important thing you're realizing from this is that it's Frank's message rang in her ears as she climbed the mountain. Substitution is rarely able to pinpoint the exact meaning of a word, but it can give you a general idea of what the word means. Another example of words that are hard to determine the meaning of in context are words that have multiple meanings. So like take the word cleave, for example. It can mean join or separate, which are total opposites. So how do you determine when the word means what? Well, the best thing to do, again, is substitution. You have two meanings here, join or separate. So every time you see cleave in a sentence, you can substitute the word cleave for join or separate and see which one makes sense. So this sentence says, the birds cleaved together as they flew from the oak tree. Well, if we use the word joined, it says the birds joined together as they flew from the oak tree. But if you put the birds separated together as they flew from the oak tree, that wouldn't make sense. The reason being is because of the word together. Together means joined or near each other. So join must be the meaning of cleave in this sentence. This next sentence says, Jim's knife cleaved the bread cleanly. So if we use the word joined, it really wouldn't make sense, because why would you use a knife to join something? Everyone knows that a knife is used to cut something. So because of knife, we know that in this case, cleaved means separated. So those are some examples of how to use substitution to determine the meaning of a word. A great way to organize ideas from a text is by using a graphic organizer. And a graphic organizer is basically a way to simplify information and just take the key points from the text. So you can see why this would be helpful for a reader, because it helps the reader determine the main points and see how the main points are connected to other main points. So one type of graphic organizer is the timeline. And this helps the reader determine the main points and then determine chronologically when those main points took place, because you're going to have a line here, you have different points, and so main points are going to go under these vertical lines here along the horizontal line depending on when they took place, first, second, or last. Another great form of a graphic organizer is the outline, because here the reader is determining main points and then the subpoints that go along with those main points. So it helps the reader determine what is most important and what is second, or what is secondly important. The spider map is also a great resource. Here the reader takes a circle and puts the main point inside of the circle and then draws legs off of this web here, or off this circle to make a web. And then at the end of each point is another main point. And then main points can even branch off of these. So really what you have here is you have the main point, or maybe the thesis of the whole paper. Then you have the main points coming off of that thesis, and then you might even have subpoints coming off of those main points. Then there also is the Venn diagram. And this is helpful in determining main points and seeing how the main points of the passage are connected to others, because you may have some circles like this. And so here you have a main point inside of each circle. And so you can see how some main points are connected and overlapping with another main point, and then some main points are overlapping with two other main points. And so it helps the reader determine the main points and helps them to determine how the main points are connected with the other main points. A graph is a common way to present information in a visual format. Here we have two common types of graphs, the line graph and the bar graph. But they're similar in many ways. Notice here they both have a title, like income versus education. Or the title could be something longer, like a comparison of average income with levels of education. But it still means the same thing. And this title over here is money spent on groceries monthly. So in both types of graphs, you have an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis is the horizontal line. So notice here, education is the x-axis and income is the y-axis. Here we don't have lines drawn, but you can still see here the month of the year is the x-axis and the money spent each month is the y-axis, because that's vertical, it's up and down. Generally, the x-axis, this line right here, represents the independent variable. That's the variable that the writer can move around. So here, whoever made this graph, for education they could put high school, bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctorate. And so they're setting out the different levels of education. But notice, if there's an independent variable, there also has to be a dependent variable. Whoever's writing something, whoever's constructing a graph can't have two independent variables. In other words, they can't choose what both of the variables are going to end up being. So if they choose high school to be right here, they don't decide what the income level for high school is going to be. They have to research that and figure out what that is. So the y-axis is generally the dependent variable and depends on whatever the independent variable is. So the same case is that over here. The constructor of this graph set out January, February, March, and April to be plotted along the x-axis. So this is the independent variable, and the dependent variable is the money spent each month. The person who made this graph doesn't get to decide how much money was spent on each graph because they're just reporting what was already spent. So basically the difference between these two graphs is just how the information is presented within the graph. So here we have a line graph, and so it's basically what it sounds like. It's a line. So these points right here are plotted in different areas. So say this mark right here was high school. That was the level of education, and the income right here is $36,000. And so there's a point put right here. And then this next one is an associate's degree, and so the income level is $54,000. So a point is put right there, and then a line is used to connect those two dots. And the same goes all the way down with different levels of education. And the lines are used to connect the dots to see the general flow of how the income level is changing as education changes. Now over here, we have a bar graph. And so basically, like for January right here, we're looking at how much money was spent in January. And so this bar right here is going to raise as high as the amount of money that was spent. So say $80 was spent. Notice here this bar ends at about the $80 mark. But over here in April, over $200 was spent in that month for groceries. So the line exceeds $200 to maybe, I don't know, $240 right there. And so that's how that is represented. So there's pros and cons to using a line graph or a bar graph. It really is up to how the writer of the graph wants to present the information. But a line graph is generally better for seeing flow over time, to see if something remains constant or if it rises or falls. Whereas a bar graph is more focused just on that particular variable. So like in January, how much did groceries cost? It's not so much concerned with comparing the different months. It's just seeing, okay, in February, how much money was spent. See, if this information was presented in a line graph, the focus would be on the rise and fall of amounts spent on groceries, because you would see in January it was down here, then the graph raises up for February and falls for March and rises again for April. So basically, you're presenting the same information in either graph. It's just the focus of the information is different. Irony is a statement that suggests its opposite. Look at this example. A man walks in his home covered in mud and in tattered clothes. His wife says, "How was your day?" And the man replies, "Great." This is an example of irony, because obviously the husband did not have a great day. He went through some kind of major conflict where he now is covered in mud and has tattered clothes, but he still says his day was great. So this is irony, because irony is when the literal meaning is different than the intended meaning. Here, the literal meaning of what the husband said is that he had a great day. But the intended meaning is to say, I actually had a terrible day, and that's why he's saying great, because this is an example of irony. Now, you may think that this is sarcasm, but irony is different than sarcasm. Like I said, irony is a statement in which the literal meaning is opposite from the intended meaning. Sarcasm is also a statement in which the literal meaning is opposite from the intended meaning, but it's also meant to be insulting to the person at whom it is directed. A sarcastic statement suggests that the other person is stupid enough to believe an obviously false statement is true. Irony is a bit more subtle than sarcasm. A metaphor is a type of figurative language in which the author equates one thing with that of something else. This sentence says, "The bird was an arrow arcing through the sky." Now here, the bird wasn't actually an arrow, but instead the author is saying the bird is like an arrow arcing through the sky. This is a way for the author to get to think about the bird in a different way and to equate it with an arrow and an arrow making an arc through the sky. This is a way for the author to describe the bird in more detail without being direct and obvious, because the author could say, the bird swiftly flew through the air and bent through the air, making a big arc. But that's not very interesting. That doesn't evoke emotion on the part of the reader. So instead, in this case, the author chose to use a metaphor, saying the bird was like an arrow arcing through the sky, and because of that, the reader can conclude that the bird must have flown swiftly and then bent through the sky, maybe going up and then coming back down. Now sometimes authors use metaphors, but they don't directly tell you what they're talking about. Here we knew that the author was talking about a bird, but look at this sentence. Swaying skeletons reached for the sky and groaned as the wind blew through them. Here we don't know exactly what the author is talking about, but we can infer that the author is talking about trees, because it would make sense that trees would sway back and forth, and that maybe at this point it's in the winter and the trees don't have any limbs, so it's just like the skeleton of a tree and it's swaying back and forth. So that would make sense here, and so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what the author is talking about. In this case it wasn't, but nevertheless this is another example of a metaphor where the author is comparing the trees to skeletons, and that allows the reader to look at the trees in a different perspective. Now we're thinking about trees as big skeletons swaying back and forth and groaning. And so that's a way for the author to give us a different perspective about these trees without being real direct and obvious. So just to review, a metaphor is a type of figurative language in which the author equates one thing to that of something else. A narrative is basically a piece of writing that is a story. So I'm going to write that up here on the board, because that's important to remember, that a narrative is a story. Now, notice in the word narrative that it kind of sounds like the word narrator or narration. Now, when you think of a narrator, it's generally the person in a play that guides the audience through the story and tells what's going on. So in the same way, a narrative is basically telling the reader a chain of events. So it's a story, and then it can be nonfiction or fiction, as long as it is a story. Now, there are certain characteristics that a piece of writing must have in order to be considered a narrative. First of all, it must have a plot. A plot is basically the meat of the story. It starts out with the problem that arises in the story, and then how the characters try to overcome that problem, and then finally ends with the characters overcoming the problem. So you notice that I talked about the characters doing things in the plot. So that's the second thing that a narrative must have, characters. These characters can be people, animals, or things, but generally it's going to be people. There has to be some kind of interaction between the characters in order to form the plot, which forms the narrative. And then finally, a narrative is going to include figurative language. Figurative language is basically something that's not totally true. Like, think of a metaphor, which is a type of figurative language. Like if I were to say, the moon was a frosty snowball. Look at that sentence. The moon was a frosty snowball. So notice here, the moon wasn't actually a frosty snowball, but basically the writer is saying the moon looked like a frosty snowball. So that's an example of figurative language, because this is an example of a metaphor. So any kind of narrative is going to include sentences like this one that leave some things up to the reader's imagination. So the important thing to remember about a narrative is that it tells a story. Personification is a type of figurative language in which the writer describes the non-human as having human qualities. So look at this elementary example of personification. The car smiled at me. Here, the car is described as smiling, but smiling is a human quality. So the fact that the car smiled is personification, because the car here didn't actually smile because it's not a human. But for whatever reason, it appeared to the writer that the car smiled at them. Maybe the front of the car is configured in such a way that it looks like a face and it looks like it's smiling. Or maybe it was more of just the writer's imagination. But whatever the case is an example of personification, because the writer is giving a human quality, smiling, to a non-human. Now sometimes personification can include giving human qualities to animals, like in George Orwell's book Animal Farm, where animals reenact an entire war. So that can be the case as well. But generally I think of personification as pertaining to inanimate objects, but it can be animals as well. The tree groaned in the wind is another example of personification. Here, the tree is a non-human, yet the author is giving it this human quality of groaning. Now, you may think, okay, if a tree is going back and forth in the wind, it may sound like it's groaning. Well, yes, it may sound like it's groaning, but here the author is saying that the tree actually groaned, which cannot be true because trees don't have mouths. So this is an example of personification, like I said, because although the tree made a groaning sound, the tree did not actually groan. Personification can be used for a variety of reasons, but often it's to make the reader look at something with a different perspective. Personification evokes a different tone than if, like, consider this sentence. If the author just said, the car looked like it was smiling at me, that sentence sounds different than the car smiled at me. So depending on whatever tone the author is going for, the author may choose to use or not to use personification. A simile is a figurative expression in which the author compares one thing to that of another using the word like or as. So here are some examples. The sun was like an orange, eager as a beaver, nimble as a mountain goat. Here the author is using the word like, and in these two phrases the author is using the word as. Either case is fine, the author just needs to use the word like or as. And so in this sentence the author is comparing the sun to the orange, saying the sun was like an orange. And this gives the reader a different perspective on what they are reading. It now allows the reader to think about the sun in terms of an orange. No longer is the reader thinking about the sun in the sky, the reader is now imagining an orange in the sky. And here, if the author was describing someone as being nimble, no longer are they just thinking of someone being nimble, they're thinking of that person as a mountain goat now. And so that's the point of a simile. Now, if you're familiar with metaphors, similes differ from metaphors. Look at this sentence right here. This is a simile. The house was like a shoebox. Now, in a metaphor, like would be removed, and the sentence would just say the house was a shoebox. See, in a metaphor, the author never acknowledges that the house and the shoebox are not the same thing. However, in a simile, like stays there, and so the author is acknowledging that house and shoebox are not the same thing, they're just like one another. So the difference between a metaphor and a simile is just kind of the emotion that the author is trying to evoke, because metaphors and similes evoke different tones. So the purpose of metaphors and similes is pretty much the same thing, to get the reader to think of one thing in terms of another thing. But writers will choose to use a simile or a metaphor, just depending on the tone. A stereotype is basically a bias against a specific group of people or a specific place. So you as a reader need to be attentive to when someone is using a stereotype. So like I said, a stereotype is a bias against a specific group or place. And stereotypes are generally a generalization. And a generalization is basically where you look at a specific group of people and you take what is true for some of the people and apply it to everyone. Like, take for example, if I said everyone in Nebraska is a corn farmer. Now, there are many corn farmers in Nebraska, but not everyone there is a corn farmer. So I took what was true for a few people and applied it to everyone in Nebraska. So that's a mild case of a stereotype, because most stereotypes are negative. You may have heard some negative stereotypes towards specific cultures, ethnicities, and religions. So anytime you as a reader notice a stereotype, recognize that means the author is ignorant and not curious. In other words, they may not be willing to look into the details. They see something that they think is true, and so then they state it as fact. So that's why I say they're not very curious. And they're also ignorant, because they may be aware that they are using a stereotype, but they may not care. And so they're ignorant about that, which means they're also going to be ignorant about other things. So as a reader, be attentive to when a writer is using stereotypes. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part. But without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail and second, and give another supporting detail and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like for example or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. The narrator plays an important role in the story, and it's important that you as a reader understand the narrator. So a narrator can talk in first person or in third person. In first person, the narrator will use pronouns like I and me because they're talking about things they're experiencing and things they see happening. And in this case, the narrator will actually be a character in the story, so it's important to understand which character they are playing. In third person, the pronouns he and she are used because the narrator is looking onto the situation, saying he did this or she did this, and so they're not a character in the story. So that's one thing you need to understand about the narrator. The second thing is how much does the narrator know? And you may be wondering why this is important. But some narrators are going to know what all the characters' thoughts are, and some narrators do not know that. And some narrators will be able to explain to the reader what's going on and their thoughts about it, and some narrators will just let the plot speak for itself. So how much the narrator knows influences how much the reader will know, because however much the narrator knows, they will then tell the reader that. So it's important to understand how much the narrator actually knows. A thesaurus is a reference book that gives synonyms of words, and a synonym is just a word with a similar meaning. And so a thesaurus differs from a dictionary, and then a thesaurus does not give a definition of the word. It just gives a list of synonyms. So here's a sample entry in a thesaurus. The word is explain, and the thesaurus lists 3 synonyms here: describe, teach, and clarify. Because describe, teach, and clarify all are similar to explain and have similar definitions, but they're definitely different words and have slightly different definitions. So thesauruses are helpful in 2 cases, when reading and in writing. They're helpful to readers because it helps a reader find the meaning of a word. So say, for example, I was reading something and I came across the word explain. And if I did not know what the word explain meant, I could look it up in a thesaurus and find these other words. And I may know what clarify means, so I see the word clarify and I think, okay, now I know what explain means. Now the other case that a thesaurus is helpful in is when you are writing. And it's helpful in writing because it helps the writer to vary word choice. Sometimes a writer is trying to write a certain sentence on a particular topic, and in their sentence they are using a particular word, but it's not quite right, and they want a word with a little bit of a different definition. So they can look that word up in a thesaurus and then pick one of the synonyms of that word. Or maybe they have a thesis statement and they use the thesis statement at the beginning of the paper, and they want to kind of restate the thesis statement, but they want to use different words later in the paper. So the writer could look up the words in that sentence in a thesaurus and replace those words with a synonym to vary word choice to make it more interesting for the reader. A sentence can be identified according to its structure. So the 4 different types of structures are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence is made up of just an independent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So here's an example. It rained yesterday. So we have a subject here, it, and a verb, rained. And so this sentence isn't dependent on anything else to be a complete sentence. It's a sentence in its own right because it can stand alone. It rained yesterday is a grammatically correct sentence. So we call that an independent clause. Now, a compound sentence is made up of 2 or more independent clauses. Now, I'm just going to write here IC for independent clause. And so an example of a compound sentence is she likes to eat fruit and I like to eat vegetables. So notice here that we have a subject and a verb. She likes to eat fruit, and a subject and a verb. I like to eat vegetables. So this is an independent sentence because it could be a sentence by itself, and this is an independent sentence because we could just say, I like to eat vegetables, and that's a sentence by itself. But notice here, we have them joined together by a comma and the conjunction and. And so there's a few ways you can join 2 independent clauses together. One is by that example right there, by a comma and a conjunction. And so and is a conjunction as well as words like for, but, so, and yet. And then we can also join 2 independent clauses by just a semicolon. So right here we could take out the comma and just put a semicolon. It's less common, but it's still grammatically correct. And another way is just to put a conjunction with no comma. Now that wouldn't really be grammatically correct in this sentence right here, but I'm going to show you a sentence in a little bit where this would be appropriate. You only need to do that when you have 2 short independent clauses being joined together. Now the third sentence structure is a complex sentence. It has 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So I'm going to write here independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So an example of that is, because I like to drink milk, my bones are very strong. Now here you see the subject I and the verb like. So you have I like to drink milk. You have a subject and a verb, but this is not a complete sentence. This is a dependent clause because of this word right here, because. If you were to say, because I like to drink milk, that wouldn't be a complete sentence. You need something else to it to finish it out. So that's why we call this a dependent clause, because it's dependent on another clause to be complete. Now here, on the other side of this comma, we have an independent clause. Here we have a subject, bones, and a verb, are. So my bones are very strong, can stand alone. So it's joined together with this dependent clause with a comma. Now, dependent clauses can also come after the independent clause, and you could have more than 1 dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, a dependent clause is usually introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, that, or something else like that. Or a subordinating conjunction, maybe like although, because, or when. Now finally, we get to the 4th sentence structure, which is a compound complex sentence, which is 2 or more independent clauses plus 1 or more dependent clauses. So we have 2 independent clauses and at least 1 dependent clause. And so an example of that is the plane arrived and we took off because we were already late. So right here we have plane as the subject and arrived as the verb. And then here we have we as the subject and took as the verb. So this is an independent clause right here because it can stand alone. And this is an independent clause. Now right here we have a dependent clause. Now again, we have a subject and we have a verb. We and were are the subject and verb here, but this is not an independent clause. If we were to take the word because off, it would be an independent clause. We were already late. But because of the word because, it's now a dependent clause. Now right here you may be thinking, we have two independent clauses here joined by just a conjunction and no comma, because what you're used to seeing is a comma right here, which that is appropriate. We could also just put a semicolon right here. That would also be appropriate to join the two independent clauses. But we can actually not use a semicolon and we can not use a comma and just have a conjunction, because this is one of the cases where, like I was saying earlier, you just need a conjunction because you have two short independent clauses. So again, the four sentence structure types are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence.
When taking your test, you may come across questions that ask you to find synonyms. Synonyms are words that have similar meaning. They don't always have the exact same meaning because there are nuances or little differences between words that may have overlap in their meanings. And so as you're looking at the word and you're looking at the options below, one of the test-taking strategies that you may find helpful is to go through the choices that you have and immediately eliminate those that you know cannot be the possible answer. And that narrows the scope down until you get closer to the actual meaning. Now obviously, if you know the answer, you always go with what you know, but if you're uncertain as to what the correct answer is, then this little strategy can be helpful. You're not looking for a perfect synonym, you're looking for something that is a close synonym, something that has a similar meaning, an overlap in meaning, even if there's some slight nuances or little differences between the words. And so I've got an example on the board. We're going to go over this just to try to illustrate this briefly. And hopefully this will help you understand the test-taking strategy of looking for the close or nearly perfect synonym if there's not one that's an exact match. So we have the word coward, and we're looking for a word with similar meaning to coward. And here are our choices then below. First one, gutless. Second one, bore. Third one, judge. And the fourth one, brave. Now as you're looking at the word coward and you're looking at the choices, we can automatically eliminate one because it's not a synonym, it's an antonym. It's something with the exact opposite meaning. So brave can be ruled out automatically. We know someone who is a coward is not brave. So you've got three choices left now. You think of the word coward. Pretty sure it's not the word judge. So we were absolutely certain on this one, and we're pretty sure on C. Now we're left with two answers. We've already narrowed the field. We've got a 50% chance if we just had to outright guess. But as we're thinking about the word coward, we think, well, you know, the word gutless comes pretty close to coward. It's not a perfect match, but it's closer than bore. And maybe we don't even know what a bore is. You know, someone, oh, you're such a bore. And we're not sure what that word is, but we know that gutless has some overlap and it's close. And so if we're having to guess, once again, we're not certain of the answer. I'm assuming for the case of our example here that we don't automatically know that A is the answer. But we've been able to narrow it down by eliminating the choices that we know are not correct. And when we're left with two, we've been able to narrow it further by saying, I know there's enough overlap between coward and gutless that we're going to go with A. And once again, this is just an example to illustrate a test-taking strategy. When you're taking your test and you come to the portion that has synonyms, if you automatically know the right answer, go with the right answer. But if you're uncertain, then basically just start looking at the answers and eliminate the ones that you know it cannot possibly be until you've narrowed it down to the ones that are possibilities, and then start looking for overlap in meaning. Because often on these tests, they're not testing your ability to find a perfect synonym. They want you to be able to realize the relationship between words and the nuances between words, the little differences, so that you can say, this is close to that meaning. This is the one that has at least some overlap, even though it's not a perfect match. So we're looking for nearly perfect synonyms, not the perfect synonym when we take these tests. That's part of what the testers are trying to gauge. Do you understand the subtle differences between words, not just the one that's a perfect match as in a definition? Anyway, I hope this has been helpful for you as you take your test to think through synonyms and looking for the one that's closest or has some overlap in meaning, not the perfect match, but a close match, and the strategy of eliminating answers that you know cannot possibly be the right one. If you'd like to learn more about this and other related matters, beneath this video you'll find a link. If you'll click on it, it'll take you to a website with that information. And while you're at that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.